You would think, would you not, that after a while, when you came back, you would have a nice lesson to work with? It is awful, just awful. And remember this little piece that Fred gave us last week? Well, I was trying to find my lady, and I finally found her down here, and she first looked like a concubine, but then I noticed that her dress wasn't quite right. So she is there in her appropriate position. In many ways, let me start first. After I finished writing my thesis, after I finished writing my dissertation, I said, I will not read a textbook for the rest of my life, and I will go to high-class trash. In my head, that meant a book with some sex and some violence and some intrigue. So that meant things like Grisham and Baldacci and Cornwell and Steele and all those things that you would not read for a book club. So that was where I was. Then I looked at the lady in this passage, and I remembered that Beth had invoked her name in a prayer that she gave in church not too very long ago. And I don't mean this to sound like it's going to, but when I read Dinah, the first thought I had was, Dinah, is there anyone finer in the state of Carolina? Do you all remember that song from the 50s? And who would I think of secondly? Dinah Shore. Now, I've gotten it all out of my system. High-class trash, my Dinah stories. So I suspect we need to move on to Genesis. This is really a stinker of a passage, I think. And several commentators actually described it that way. There is Leah and there's Jacob. And remember from last week, Leah was the one he got first, but not the one he wanted first. So she was second in his head. And there were 7 children by Leah. The final child was Dinah. She was last, and she was a girl. So she really didn't have much leg to stand on, because neither of those things were very good. At the time of this passage, she was probably 14 or 15 years old. Now remember, Mary, mother of Jesus, was also about 14 or 15 years old. So things happened earlier, although we don't really know how they classified ages. So she may have been older if we would calculate it. But from what I've read, she was about 14 or 15. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that she was probably heading to one of the pagan festivals that occurred in Shechem. And if I pronounce that inappropriately, that's what it's going to be today. Shechem was a place and a person. I think Richmond does that sometimes, not necessarily person, but Moore Street Baptist Church is not on Moore Street. Grove Avenue Baptist Church is not on Grove Avenue, and now they've actually changed it just to Grove Church so we don't get confused. So sometimes places and people can be called and named the same thing, and that is the case here. So she was probably on her way there. Interestingly, she had probably been before also. She was kind of, from what I could read, a party girl. She liked getting out and she liked getting around. Do you all remember the movie Fatal Attraction?
Mhm.
This is sort of a
That
fatal
was-
attraction chapter. She went there, she got herself in some mess, so to speak, and people died. Also, do you remember the book, The Red Tent? That was the first book that I remember our church book club reading. And Elena Woolley asked me to go with her to that book club. I hadn't read the book, and she said, don't worry, I haven't either. Most of the people that are there won't have read it either, but we need to go. And it was really a fictional account of this particular chapter in the Bible. So it was what we would kind of call a historical novel, because Dinah was a midwife in this book, and she went to Shechem to help with the birth of a child in Hamor's house. So things went from bad to worse there, as they actually did in Genesis. Let me pause just for a moment. When I was back at VCU in the old days, and they still have this, there's a code of conduct, and then there is an integrity committee. I was asked to be part of the code of conduct group, and we had to be trained by outside group on how to deal with sexual matters that occurred at VCU. VCU is not the only place that these kinds of things occur. In every college, there are far more of these instances than we know about. But nonetheless, had to be trained. There had to be 5 people on the committee to hear any issues that had to do with sexual issues. Always 1 student, and then the rest could be faculty or administrators. But that had to be the composition of the committee. We had to listen to both sides of any of these activities. Always, and I underline the always part, the student was the harshest of any of the rest of the people on the committee in terms of the punishment that was rendered. But they did have a hearing, so to speak. And often, as is the case in this passage, the words that were used had so many different ways of being heard. Some people say in this passage that Dinah was raped. Some people say that she was in this consensually, and both parties had agreed. And there are lots of different words that are used to describe the same particular act. What is implied by several historians was that Shechem really wanted her for his wife. And she probably wanted to get out of the household she was in. But we don't know that for a fact. But we also know that the father of Shechem was Hamor, and he was of upper echelon. And so Shechem really had some power and some prestige. So either out of love or a desire for the economic benefit that would have occurred had she married into this family, we don't really know. And we don't really know whether or not she willingly moved into this interaction, into this encounter. But we do know that Dinah's mother, Leah, and her blood brothers, Simon and Levi, are very important here. In many ways, they want to defend her honor, but they don't actually know what that honor is, because they don't know if she willingly was part of this or not. But what we do know is that the word daughter occurs 14 times in this passage without her name being linked to this. And there are verbs that are used in this passage, like took, like lay, like violated. Obviously, these are all translated words for us. But those words in and of themselves can have meaning. We say he took her for his wife. We say they lay together, whether or not there was sex involved. So this word can take on, or these words can take on many meanings. So we don't know for certain, but whether we do or not, Simon and Levi will take it for the worst it could possibly have been. And so they had a curiosity that needed to be resolved. They needed to look into this. Now remember that Shechem was not a Hebrew, so she was outside her boundaries in the beginning. However, Jacob, being the father, could have said, it doesn't matter, I give blessing. But Jacob is very quiet for a long time on this whole issue and allowed his sons to take the role that he should have taken. We think that he knew of these events, that he had heard about them, but we don't know exactly what he was going to do about it. But we do know that he was not as involved in the lives of these children as he was in the lives of Rachel's children. So already we have a parental issue here about favoritism. Which of these children were my favorite? Was my favorite? What am I going to do about it? But he held his peace. Also is inferred that he could have gained by this marriage because it would have provided him with different trade partners. And he needed the income, or at least thought he needed the income. So this could have been part of the reason that he just kind of lay in waiting and wanted to see what his sons would do. Well, they took it to be that she had been raped and that they needed to retaliate. They needed to serve vengeance here. And so they told Shechem and his father that he could have Dinah if they would be circumcised, because that was part of the religious piece. And they agreed to do that. While they were recovering from this operation, they went in, they killed the men, they looted the town, and they took the women. Now, in this case, we can probably surmise accurately that they raped the women. They wanted revenge, and they were out to get it because they were very angry.
They were.
Yeah, I'm not following too well.
Jacob eventually does respond, but only after all the other things have occurred. I don't know if your mother said this to you, but I heard it. Be careful where you find yourself. Be careful whom you join with, because you will be judged in the same way, whether or not you are doing the bad things or the good things. It will come that way to you.
I lost her.
And maybe that's what happened here. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what I found also interesting as I researched is that God is not mentioned at all in this chapter. And that is very different from most of the other passages in the Bible. But there is a common denominator here. The one constant in this whole chapter is that people are being led by their passion. Doesn't seem to matter what that passion is. It is what is leading them on. And it doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to see that this is happening today either. Look at how angry people are and what they do if somebody cuts them off on the highway. Look at how angry people get and what they do when they think that their spouse has not been faithful. Look at what children do to each other when they want something, they bully, they say all kinds of things, they get after each other, they exclude each other from groups. And we know some of the hurtful and hateful reactions that occur from that. My feeling is, and it's mine, I own it, having worked in environments where there are young people, whether they be public schools or whether they be colleges or universities, et cetera, is that there's trouble when there's not enough parental involvement, and there's trouble when there is too much parental involvement. So it shouldn't surprise us that in many cases, the adolescents and young people we see are just kind of aimlessly out there doing whatever. I think first and foremost, respect needs to be taught at home. And if it isn't, we have issues. And that's what occurred here. Remember, he was not particularly fond of Leah, Jacob that is. He probably couldn't care less in many ways. And he had favorites. And probably they didn't have much respect for them either, at least some of these children.
I know what he's saying.
Because favoritism in the home can create lots of issues. And here I think we see issues of anger, alienation, and obviously eventually vengeance that occurred and murder. Our assimilation in the world is probably one of the greatest dangers that are facing God's people today. Assimilation in the world is a great danger because there's subtle dangers out there. We don't actually see them, but they're always there. We sometimes react, we sometimes don't. Assimilation is a great danger because it happens in the course of everyday family life. It's a great danger because it is aggressive. So we've got subtle danger, we've got aggressive danger, we've got household issues that are occurring. The subtle things are probably not passive things. The subtle things do create issues and dangers, and we are going to have to face them. It's not necessarily war like World War II, World War I, Korean War, Vietnam War, but it is war in many ways. And I found a passage from Dwight Eisenhower that I think sort of fits here. And he said, war is a terrible thing, but if you're going to get into it, you've got to get into it all the way. The wars that we're facing today are subtle in many ways, but they are definitely affecting our homes, our families. And we need to be aware. We need to be on top of these things. They're not just in other places. Terrible things are also happening here. July the 4th, we could have had a mass shooting at Dogwood Dell, but someone listened, someone saw, someone told. We could have had far greater issues on Broad Street at Henry than we did, where a panhandler apparently asked a lady for something, probably money. She refused. He threw a chair and she drew a gun. It could have been worse. Fortunately, it wasn't. Patrick and I were on Broad Street a couple of weeks ago. We had just looked at, remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe a month now, when we had that really bad wind that came through?
Sunday morning.
On the corner of Broad and Belvedere, no, excuse me, Broad and Boulevard, behind the subway, the 3rd floor roof of an apartment building was blown off. That's only a block from Steve's house. Frightening. And I wanted to show Patrick where that was. And so we had turned onto Broad Street, looked at that. We were very close to Scott's Addition. Patrick had his window down. We were at a stoplight. I can't tell you which street, I don't know. But we were at a stoplight and I heard this person screaming and saying words that I will not repeat here, but are words that create lots of negative responses. This person was yelling at a person in a car who was stopped at the light because that person had not given this panhandler money. I mean, words that caused me to be frightened, and I was a block away. What if there's this issue of respect? There is this issue of culture. There is this issue of what's going on in our environment right now. Do we trust each other? Do we respect each other? Do we want to retaliate? Do we want violence? Do we want revenge? These are all the issues that Genesis 34 spoke to us about very succinctly and very vividly.
You can't focus.
And I will end with this. Anger will breed more anger until someone has the courage to be a reconciler. Retaliation will breed more retaliation until someone has the courage to turn the other cheek or to go the second mile. And enemies will remain enemies until someone has the courage to love and pray for them. Amen.